So good morning, everybody. It's actually a beautiful spring morning here, which is 2 days ago we had snow. Did you have snow, Deborah? Oh, you don't have, we don't hear you, but
Not today.
no, 2 days ago.
No,
Oh,
no.
oh,
Rain, rain, cold,
yeah,
raw, rain.
yeah. Well, we didn't get a lot, we just got flakes, but it was enough to be thoroughly depressing. As we're on the verge of May, and so on. Anyway, but today it's actually behaving in a spring-like manner, which is quite nice. So today's talk is going to be at least begin around two what I would call contemporary koans. They are not koans, but they are statements made by some contemporary teachers which effectively function as koans. And the first one is from Charlotte Joko Beck. No, I don't feel like I can talk about Joko without unpacking some dirty laundry. Well, I am of the school of thought that believes that if we forget the past, we are doomed to repeat it. As to opposed to the present school of thought that's gaining ground in this country is that if we don't acknowledge the past, it never happened. So I do think it's important periodically for several reasons. One, it's important a reminder. To me, it's a reminder about how we have to keep our spiritual practice and teachers in perspective, or that can lead to harm. And secondly, it's out there at various points. It's on the internet. And one of the things that people who are sort of hovering around Zen but not really wanting to practice do is retell all these tales as the reasons that they don't practice Zen. That teacher was awful, and so therefore Zen is not safe, and I'm not anyway. So it's there. You're going to encounter it, and so I always think it helps know it when you encounter it. And I'm gonna start with a piece that has nothing to do with Joko, nothing to do with this lineage. That's because it's just an awful thing that's going on. Yesterday I was over at Treetop and spent some time chatting with Jim Noack, and we have both noticed that the name Herbert Lentz and the Lentz Foundation is popping up quite prominently in the Buddhist world right now. I don't know if you've seen it, but they're sponsoring conferences. They have ads in the various Buddhist publications, Tricycle, and other places. And of all the sort of inappropriate acts that may have happened over time in the Buddhist world, Herbert Lentz stands alone as being truly evil, which is not a word that I use lightly. And so I am bringing this out and saying this because it needs to be said, because otherwise the name of Herbert Lentz and his teachings and so on are going to gain traction. They are already. Everybody's forgotten the origin story. But I heard the origin story from Steph. I did research on it. It's absolutely true. And here's the story. The other name under which Herbert Lentz is known is Swami Rama. And those of you who go back to like the 70s may remember that name. Very big. He had such a big following that he literally sold out Madison Square Garden to do a Well, he didn't just do a talk. He had a whole dog and pony show with a rock band and all sorts of things. And he claimed that, among other things, he was a Zen teacher, but he did not have Zen transmission in any lineage. As far as anybody knows, he never even studied Zen. He wrote a book that was called Surfing the Himalayas. Margaret remembers now. And that got quite a bit of attention, and it's still around, and so on and so forth. But what's awful about this man, to begin with, it was a true cult. He took all of the money from many of his students, literally all of the money, and far worse than that, he sexually abused many of his students, including raping at gunpoint. He ended up putting a gun in his mouth, I think, at about the age of 42. So clearly a mark of a deeply enlightened person. But because he took all that money from all those people and had big shows in Madison Square Garden kinds of things, he had millions of dollars when he died. And that went into this Lens Foundation. And the Lens Foundation says, well, their job is to support Buddhist causes. And various teachers, it hasn't been so prominent up till now, but various teachers, including teachers in this lineage, have taken some of that money. And their, I'm going to call it rationalization, was that they were sort of cleansing the karma, that they were going to use the money for good purposes and sort of wash away the evil that Lens had done. Well, that might fly with just one little hitch. It also required that they publicly announce their support for Lens's teachings and the fact that he was an authentic Zen teacher. So you have some prominent people in Zen, including some prominent teachers in this lineage, who've come out and made those kinds of statements. And that's continuing to, it's like having to say, yep, I'm going to give you some money, but you got to say Adolf Hitler was really a good guy. And some people are doing that. And I find that very disturbing. But it's on the rise again. He's out there. Pick up a tricycle, pick up a Buddha Dharma. You'll see ads, you'll see conferences, Lens Foundation, and people again sort of saying nice things about Herbert Lens. Enough about him. But I just feel like every time I see that, I should flash a little warning light, because there's some bad karma there that hasn't gone away. Every time somebody says what a great teacher he was, every one of the survivors of his abuse is torn apart. They're alive. They have to hear that. They have to see prominent Zen teachers telling what a wonderful guy he was. That's just wrong. Sorry. So that's under the heading of what we're talking about next. Zen, there used to be an idea that somehow Zen teachers, Zen masters were infallible. And that's a crock of shit. Okay. I don't even know where that came from. But that in itself is pernicious, because if people start to believe that, and teachers do unconscionable things, people start excusing it. It's okay. He's an enlightened person. It must be the functioning of crazy wisdom, right? That's what's said about Trumpas, the things that Trumpa did. His didn't rise to the level of Lens, but they were some pretty bad things. And everybody said, well, it was just the functioning of crazy wisdom. It's not. It's not. We gotta know it for what it is, name it for what it is, and not forget that. That's what I'm gonna say. Okay. So now coming back to Joko. Joko received transmission from Maizumi Roshi. She was in our lineage. And she left. She left the lineage. She wanted nothing to do with it. Why was that? Well, that was because Maizumi Roshi, the founder of our lineage, slept with Joko's teenage daughter. Now, at one point, a few years ago, some people were very upset and they said, oh, well, Maizumi therefore was a pedophile. Well, and Joko's daughter herself spoke up and said, no, I was 19 at the time and it was completely consensual. Now, at this time, Maizumi was, I don't know, in his 40s, 50s, married. And this was a teenage daughter of one of his senior students. And it was surreptitious, you know, so although Joko found out somehow. So this is some of the karma that we have in our lineage. What happened to Joko was awful. What happened, you know, her daughter is healing. Her daughter is still in the lineage today. I forget who her teacher is, but she's still practicing with White Plum. And she's gotten past her past and her, you know, but so it is very sad. And then at the end of her life, Joko herself became senile. She had a Dharma successor. She threw him out, denied that he was, in fact, a successor. And you know, she kind of blew everything up in her last years. And so it's a sad, sad, sad story about a woman who was a wonderful teacher. You know, the book that she's best known for is called Everyday Zen. You know, Joko had a very simple, clear understanding of and teaching of Zen. And in my estimation, that made her a wonderful teacher. So I have this sort of quote, this koan from Joko this morning. Life is a very simple matter. We're just doing what we're doing. Life is a very simple matter. We're just doing what we're doing. And she's absolutely correct. We as a species have an insane need to make our lives complicated. We have the same need to overthink things, to overanalyze things. Versus just living, just acting in a clear and direct manner. Nan Chuan said, the great way is not difficult, only avoid picking and choosing. Exactly the same statement as Joko made in a little bit different sense, right? But we're constantly picking and choosing. We're constantly making judgments. We're constantly complicating our lives. We're constantly pulled away from living fully in the present moment. So when I saw this quote from Joko, I thought that, you know, it really resonated with me. Life is a very simple matter. We're just doing what we're doing, whatever it is. And then I have another quote, another sort of koan, and I apologize. With this, I forgot to write down which. This was one of the mindfulness teachers. well, I don't know, or maybe it was one of the San Francisco Zen teachers that said this, and I apologize that I didn't write the name down. Desirable things do not have to beguile the mind, and undesirable ones do not have to bring endless resistance. We can let the winds blow through us instead of letting them buffet us about. Desirable things do not have to beguile the mind, and undesirable ones do not have to bring endless resistance. We can let the winds blow through us instead of letting them buffet us about. So this is very similar in a way to Joko's statement. It's also pointing to just living. Not being buffeted around. Sometimes I use the metaphor of surfing. It's riding the waves rather than kind of standing there and letting the waves knock us down, right? Although I loved that when I was a kid, get out in the surf and get knocked down. But so this quote, these quotes are both pointing in the same way, in the same direction. And yet, our contemporary context is so complicated and potentially so difficult. On Earth Day, probably most of you know this, I don't know if you do or don't, a Buddhist practitioner went onto the steps of the Supreme Court, poured gasoline on himself, and self-immolated. Interestingly enough, it's gotten almost no attention in the mainstream press, very little. But it has stirred up a big controversy within the Buddhist world within the last couple of weeks. At least in part due to the fact that Brad Warner, never shy about controversy, did a piece on this, which I don't know if you know, but Brad was a punk rock musician at one time. So he opens his thing playing his bass, playing some riffs. And then he starts to talk about this guy who immolated himself. And Brad did not pull punches. He just totally felt that this was an irreconcilable position, that suicide under any circumstance was intolerable, and that there was a woman teacher, right, or at least a priest, who was a friend of this guy, who talked about this as a courageous act of a selfless, courageous act. And Brad tore into that. And in fact, to go into so far as to say this woman should not be a Zen priest for taking that position. And Jim Nowak told me that Brad has taken some heat for that since, which I think is appropriate. Even if he was conflicted about this situation, attacking that woman in that way, just, so those of you who happen to be in the Jukai study group are going to get to talk about the morality or immorality or this whole situation in the context of the precepts, which is not what I wanted to do today. But to just sort of look at the larger context of this act. which obviously is the most, it's not just suicide, it's in a horrific manner. Horrific. And again, we can debate, did he do it because he really is that committed to the climate and the earth, or did he do it because he's depressed? So that's one of the things that's going on, is one group of people are sort of, in my way, sense, looking at it, almost trivializing it, say, well, it was depression, it was suicide, and therefore, it's not a noble act. It's not an act of protest. It is an act of mental illness. And I personally, I think that's being dismissive of it. However depressed this man was or wasn't, and there doesn't seem to be any indication one way or another whether he was, in what I've read. This is an extraordinary act for a human being to take. Extraordinary. Those of us who remember the 70s, remember, I think of the name of the monk was Van Dak, a Vietnamese monk who self-immolated in Saigon to protest. I don't remember anybody at the time saying, oh, no, that wasn't a protest. Van Dak was depressed, but, maybe he was. But I think we should all be staggered. I am staggered by what this man did. It hits me right in the face. Again, whatever, maybe depression contributed or didn't contribute, but partly, at least, the people who know him, the people who are close to him, said this was an act of protest. He meant this to shock the world about climate change. Okay. Again, right or wrong, I'm not saying, but it hits me right in the face. Why does it hit me in the face? Because as far as I'm concerned, this is not about him. This is about me. He was in that street pouring gasoline on himself because I was not in that street protesting. I was not in jail as a conscientious stand against what's going on today. And I say not just me, millions of us. Where are we? Why aren't there a million Buddhists in the streets of Washington, D.C. saying enough is enough, we've got to act? Why aren't there a million Buddhists doing acts of civil disobedience and ending up in jails to make the point loudly and clearly, we've got to act? So whatever the specifics, one of the key things that I feel drove this man to do this act of desperation, not saying, I'm not blaming nor elevating it, but I'm just saying, was the fact that where's the action? Where's the outrage? Where are the voices crying out loudly in mass numbers? Sure, there are people, there are wonderful people. There are Joanna Macy's in this world, right? There are Joan Halifaxes in our Buddhist side of the world who are speaking out on these things. But where are the rest of us? And again, I'm saying not the 10 of us or so on this thing today, but Buddhists, all over this country. Where are we? And it's not just Buddhists. I mean, I'm picking on Buddhists because that's who we are, but where's everybody? Where are conscientious Christians? Where are conscientious Jews? Where are conscientious Muslims? Where are we? I read an interesting piece in the Atlantic this week. And the author was talking about that we sort of have 3 baskets with which we can respond to climate change and ecological devastation. And basket 1, he said, we could seriously and radically cut down carbon emissions. And he said, but there's no will to do that. There's no evidence that humanity is really gonna, seriously and radically respond. And then he said, okay, basket number 2 is we could do, carbon mitigation things, things that remove the carbon from the atmosphere. And he said, this is enormously massive and expensive undertaking, if it's even possible. But he said, but there's no will to do it. And the third basket is we can go along and be destroyed. I'm summarizing it a little bit, but and he said, that's the basket we seem to be putting all of our energy into. And that's where, when we talk about, I just was reading, I'll read you a little of this morning, and I tried to get this off the phone, but I couldn't do it. Is the idea, this is a woman who's, I'm quoting Elizabeth Haas, associate professor of psychiatry at the University of Nevada School of Medicine. She said, we do see a tremendous amount of eco-anxiety. There are a lot of people who can feel quite isolated in their hopelessness about climate change and their grief about it. Well, why do we feel hopelessness and grief? Because we're doing nothing. Any situation in our lives, I'm a lifelong procrastinator. I'm very good at it. And if any of you want to get into a separate teaching track on how to procrastinate more effectively, let me know. We'll set up a group. But that said, when I procrastinate, the problems get bigger, right? I have anxiety. I wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning. Oh my God, what am I going to do about that? Okay. I see some nodding going on there. Okay. Anyway, and so I take a relatively small situation and now it's a monster. And it disturbs my sleep and all that, right? And so I understand this. I do this well. We are doing this on a mass level as a culture. And when we do that, our anxiety grows. Of course, we're feeling anxiety. Of course, depression is on the rise. Of course, we're going to see more suicide because people are going to feel more hopeless and despair. And on one level, the cure is simple. The cure is action. Praxis, do something. And we're not. I mean, that's a little bit hyperbole, but as a broad culture, as a nation, as a civilization, we're not doing. We're more committed to the GDP than the survival of our children and grandchildren. So this guy talked about the timeline. Well, people my age, I don't have to worry. I'm going to be dead before this gets really bad. Even my kids may escape it. But my grandkids are screwed. And that's interesting, right? To be willing to open our minds, to step out of our own self-interest enough to say, hey, even if this isn't about me, it's about the future generations. It's about the future of our planet. It's about the future of all the beings on this planet. And maybe, just maybe, my comfort is secondary to all of that. And that I need to act in some way. So if I apologize if I'm a little more preachy than usual. I feel I'm frustrated. If a 1,000,000-person march on Washington was being put together for the climate, I would be there. And if they said, how many of you are willing to, sit on the ground until you're taken away in cuffs, I would do that. I've done that several times already. I hate it, but I would do that. But it's not there. It's not there. I don't know. I don't know. So this poor guy goes onto the steps. And goes up in flames and dies in the most horrible manner. And we're sweeping it away. Oh, it's mental health. No, yeah, I guess it's mental health. It's all of our mental health. All of our mental health is deteriorating. If we don't think it is, we're not paying attention. And since our medical health and our physical health are closely related, all of our physical health is suffering. We may not see it, but I think some of us already do. It's pretty conspicuous in some places. So how can we as Buddhists, and now I'm saying not the 10 of us here, Buddhists globally, Zen Buddhists globally, we recite the 4 vows. The Bodhisattva vows. We are committed to the well-being of all beings, to the world. Where are we?
Right. The juxtaposition of climate change and how to motivate people, human beings to action with the earlier message of living simply it just confounds me. There's no resolution there. And just kind of just keeps me from knowing how to live simply, basically, how to not complicate things. It's just so complicated. I don't want to get depressed over it. It's a sad situation.
Thank you, Melissa. You were a little difficult to understand. Did people understand what Melissa was saying? So one of you who's nodding your head want to repeat it because her connection isn't, or summarize it, her connection isn't very good.
The part that I heard was that we maybe talk about living simply and simplifying our lives, and that we put some stock in that, but the reality is we don't do it. I may not have heard properly, but that's what I heard.
Well, I was saying like I am in a bad situation with my connection, but that climate change seems to, and the problems just kind of keep me from feeling like living simply is there for me. It's a complicated issue, and there's no way to simplify it, really.
Thank you.
While I have my mic on, I'll chime in, because what you're saying resonated with me to the extent that a few years ago, I read a review by Nathaniel Rich of the book The Overstory, Richard Powers' story about trees, et cetera, et cetera. So he was reviewing that, and it struck me so deeply what he had to say that I copied some of it, and it's right in my little, happens to be right in this little area where I'm sitting. So I pulled it out, and I'll try to just read some of the things that I think are really pertinent. He said, the climate problem is a human problem. A short-term species cannot adequately prepare for the long term and won't, if doing so means sacrificing present convenience. No amount of bad news will change that. And then he goes on to say, you know, we say it's misinformation or failure to excite the imagination. But he said, then he goes on to say, it's easier for politicians to claim scientific weakness than to tell the truth. You know, like we're working on this, but you know, we need to do more. But it's in their own self-interest to just keep their constituents happy. So here's the point, and that raises a more difficult question: not whether we should take action, but how to come to terms with the fact that our species has proved itself incapable of doing so. That just went like a knife through my heart when I read that.
Thank you. Yeah.
But I also think that Buddhism can hold that and not be defeated and just do what we can do. And I agree, I would love to go out on the street, and I keep wondering, where are the young people? And I talk to my own grandchildren who are young adults, and it's not what they're talking about. I don't know why, but we perhaps are a short-term species that don't know how to plan for the future, cannot sacrifice for the future.
It's actually not true. I mean, I just, you know, we are a short-term culture, right? The Iroquois planned 7 generations into the future. So I can't buy that we as a species are incapable. I can buy that we as a culture are incapable. But we can't change what we are as a species, but we can change what we are as a culture. You know, although, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm hearing other, you know, there are scientists saying that we are dead men walking as a species, that all species rise and fall, and that humanity is now approaching its period of decline and will be going extinct. If we accept that, though, I think we have to change the bodhisattva vow to say, creations are numberless. I vow to free them when it's hopeful and convenient. I mean, and I'm saying that from sort of, I just don't think we have the luxury of giving up. That in itself is, if let's put it on an individual level. If I'm near the end of my life and I stop eating because I want to die, is that suicide? I think it is. It's just a little slower method than taking pills or picking up a gun, but it's suicide. I'm intentionally causing, I'm not acting. So there can be, seems to me that to not act, to just come to that conclusion of, okay, this is the end, here it comes, is sort of a form of collective suicide. But I think that's happening a lot. And I don't know what, it's a good question about young people. I don't know where, I don't have enough contact with them to know. I know my grandson is terrified. He does not think he has a future. And to some extent, he's right? I mean, he may not have a future.
So my experience with the young ones there are very intentional young ones. So, I've got two sons who are one of them is going apeshit, tried to drop out of college to solve getting carbon blowing the fucking carbon people out of the world financially. He really was on a path to do that. And his co-partner ended up with severe bipolar hospitalization. So, really in the thick of it. And so for me, this guy igniting himself, one of the things that came up for me was a terror that my son would choose to do the same fucking thing. I think it's a very, I understand that there are reasons why he did it and cultural references, but I think that it could explode in a way that is detrimental to our potential to act. And specifically, I worry about the terribly angry kids. My kid is pissed, as he should be. My second son is more mainstream and intends to do good, but is not as ravenously pissed. So I see it. I feel that pulse. And I actually am feeling more and more like part of my karma job is to try to help keep somewhat of an even keel to support these very potentially empowered kids. They're very smart and they do have power. Or at least they're at least fighting for power, really fighting for power. And I'm someone who has seen power mongers as being devastating to humanity, but now I'm seeing, power, the need to take power as arguably our only hope, actually. Gotta fight back, which is it speaks to the issue of simplicity. Not so simple. Not so fucking simple. Not so simple. Survival, though, maybe arguably is very simple. You say, we're dying. We have to survive. We got to figure out what the hell to do if we do have belief in the value of the human species, surviving. And I'll just say another thing is that I'm so disgusted. I myself personally, with the fact that we may literally be throwing away our democracy in this fucking, I'm so pissed. But so as a 65-year-old, I'm pissed, and I could just imagine what this means for the smart young ones who are idealistic and who can't understand how this is happening. So it's okay. I'll stop.
Well, and that's exactly why I raised this in the context of Joko's quote, because sometimes simple is not simple. Right. And sometimes just doing what we're doing is a very complicated place to be.
I want to mention that, I'm even more worried, as bad as the ecological situation is, I'm even more worried about nuclear war and the potential for biological warfare. We've actually got Putin now threatening to use nuclear weapons in response to actions that we are taking. And this is, if we get through this particular thing, which I think we probably will, the threat remains, So maybe part of why more isn't being done about the ecological situation is that it's the threat to humanity that exists now from so many directions is so completely overwhelming. I don't even, when I think about it, like statistically, every year there's some chance of something going wrong, nuclear war, biological weapon release that's 100 times worse than COVID. Every year there's a small chance of that happening. And then eventually, it seems like statistically, it's hard to know how it's going to be avoided, given enough time, so it really is overwhelming if you look at it that way, which I tend to do, unfortunately. So then how can you put your full passion, if you're a young person seeing all this, how can you put your full passion into the ecological situation when there's so many other things, so I don't know. That's all I have to say on it right now.
Well, all true. And so maybe taking ecological out of context isn't fair, because it is part of such our universal stupidity, as opposed to simply about that. Why aren't, we've got this immediate crisis with Putin, yes. And we've got his buddy Kim Jong-un over there, who's also now threatening nuclear use of nukes and has significant capability now. And who knows who else. But so why aren't we having nuclear disarmament talks? It's kind of like, it's almost the same thing. We're just resigning ourselves to what you just said, guys. Sooner or later, we're going to blow ourselves the fuck up, and we're just going to keep, in the meanwhile, we're going to, I don't know what. So, as opposed to, okay, why aren't we as a, collectively as a people on this planet saying we want nuclear disarmament talks? We want some serious effort on the part of all the governments before this gets worse. We want a real ban on biological weapons across this planet. On and on. It's like this is the paradox that we somehow are accepting all of these things, no matter how terrible they are. Maybe it's just because we're so overwhelmed. Maybe it's just, taking what you said, Gary, is just the collective weight of all of these makes us feel like, oh, it's impossible. There's no way we're going to make it to the 21st century. So let's just, party like it's 1999.
I mean, part of it is the Kim Jong-un doesn't care about our protests, at all. No matter how much we protest, it will have no influence whatsoever, on
No.
those people.
Correct. But the protest could affect Western governments that could shut down North Korea and bring him to the table. Possibly. I mean, again, it's like, okay, do we try something or do we do nothing? The results of doing nothing are pretty much guaranteed. I mean, what you're saying, Gary, is, it's almost a statistical, if you look at that clock that the Union of Concerned Scientists we're like in the last seconds, and we, so do we do something to turn the clock back, or do we just sit here and watch the last seconds tick away?
The dominant caste in our country is not interested in doing anything of substance.
Well, absolutely. Absolutely. And look at the lunatics. I'm sorry. Look at Elon Musk, who is acquiring more power and influence day by day. And as far as I can tell, is a pretty deranged human being with some pretty bizarre right-wing perspectives, and who has attained so much power and so much influence that he alone may be able to shape this world to his will.
I just have to say, for me, what comes up over and over is somehow holding the space as I'll say very loosely, enlightened beings, we'll just say very loosely, is part of what needs to happen. We have to become, as a species, more enlightened. I'm just saying, I'm just saying, we have to figure out what to do, blah, blah, blah. But we also have to emerge as enlightened versions of ourselves, or not make it. That's how it feels. So again, I see my young ones, and for Isaac, I keep thinking if he could sit, I don't see it happening right now, but if the kid could sit, he would have a better chance to survive long enough to be more impactful. Just saying.
Do you think that sitting requires a certain amount of optimism? That you're investing time now, that there's going to be a return, a reason for sitting? And if you sort of have a nihilistic perspective, why sit? Might as well do drugs, feel good all the time.
It seems to me, again, just as a layperson, that a little sitting. I understand that their idea is that it's an all or nothing thing that you become enlightened. Clearly, we don't want to go there today, but it seems to me that a little sitting helps ground and contribute a kind of hope and sanity, and that is helpful. I don't, that's kind of the issue of, well, do you think that you have to sit for 20 years in order to get somewhere, so to speak, that you're not supposed to try to get anywhere? Or can you just sit a little and contribute sanity to yourself and others as a young one? And I think that you can. It's just,
Well,
my-
that's in effect what the mindfulness movement is saying. That's not aimed at enlightenment. It's aimed at feeling better and being a better human being, right? And they, I mean, some people in that movement do long retreats, but most don't. They sit and, they feel better, and they're a little more clear, and they're a little more compassionate, and a little more in touch with their humanity.
and they can still go for the long haul if they survive.
But if they want, there's always that. It's not. Yeah, the other choice is never excluded. But
I have a number of friends who, because of AA, were told to sit, who didn't believe in it, who thought it was a complete hogwash, who did it reluctantly, irritatedly, and were astounded over time at what it did to them. So it is possible for someone to sit under duress or to sit without a shred of belief in anything connected with it and have it be effective. I just throw that out.
well, look at the inmates who sit. Some of whom are lifers, some of whom are never getting out, and yet they find their lives transformed by sitting.
I think the very fact that when we sit, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what's going to become clear to us is a hopeful aspect of it.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Deborah. I mean, I think that's true in all realms. We have a certain amount of predictive science that we give power to, but the fact is we're not very good at predicting things. Because we're talking about massive chaotic systems with so many variables that, maybe the greatest quantum computers can kind of digest that level of information, but certainly we can't. Gary says no. Thank you. So who knows? We don't know, and we don't know what event can change things and transform things. So I think that's the other thing. And I don't know if that's exactly the point you were making there. But for me, that's the other piece that's sort of, I'm, excuse me, I make these judgments based on what I can see at the moment in front of my eyes, but I can't predict what's going to happen this afternoon in my own life here, let alone what's going to happen across the planet, across the universe, across, So I think when we make nihilistic predictions, we're just as potentially at error as if we made, positive Pollyanna-ish predictions. We just don't know. And where does that leave us? In my view, it leaves us to do the best that we can. And who knows, maybe that's enough. The thing that the sociologists talk about, and I'm going to butcher the statistic, but that it only takes a very tiny percentage of the population to unite around a certain viewpoint to change the whole tide. And it's minuscule. It's like 3 or 4% of people get together about one thing. They can change the outcome across the whole culture. But the guarantee, I can guarantee if 3 or 4% do nothing, nothing changes, right? I mean, it's. Okay, time to end.
Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to put an end to them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The enlightened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to put an end to them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The enlightened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to put an end to them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The enlightened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it.
Everybody be well. Have a good week.